Chapter 30, The Tide Rises. Did Peebee's mother call? Graham said. Did she come home? Did Peebee phone the police? Oh, I hope this isn't a sad story, she said. Phoebe did go to the police. It was on the day that Mr. Berkway read us the poem about the tide and the traveler. A poem that upset both me and Phoebe, and I think it is what convinced her, finally, that she had to tell the police about her mother. Mr. Berkway leaped through the doorway in his usual style, waving his arms and saying, "What a day!" and "Isn't life glorious?" Phoebe leaned over to me and said, "He's faking it. He doesn't want anyone to know he's a filthy murderer." Mr. Berkway read a poem by Mr. Longfellow. It was called "The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls." Over and over in the poem is the line, "The tide rises, the tide falls." And the way Mr. Berkway read this poem, you could actually hear the tide rising and falling, rising and falling. In the poem, a traveler is hurrying toward a town, and it is getting darker and darker, and the sea calls to the traveler, and the waves with their soft white hands wash out the traveler's footprints. The next morning, the day returns, but nevermore, returns the traveler to the shore, and the tide rises, the tide falls. Mr. Berkway asked people for their reactions to the poem. Megan said that it sounded soft and gentle, and it almost made her go to sleep. "Gentle?" I said. "It's not gentle, it's terrifying." My voice was shaking, but I couldn't stop it. There is a person walking along the beach, and the night is getting black, and the person keeps looking behind him to see if someone is following. And just when he is looking behind him, a huge wave comes up and pulls him into the sea. "A murder," Phoebe said. I went barreling on as if it was my poem and I was an expert. The waves with their soft white hands grab the traveler. They drown him. They kill him. He's gone. Ben said, "Maybe he didn't drown. Maybe he just died, like normal people die." Phoebe said, "He drowned." I said, "It isn't normal to die. It isn't normal. It's terrible." Megan said, "What about heaven? What about God?" Mary Lou said, "God? Is he in this poem?" Ben said, "Maybe dying could be normal and terrible." When the bell rang, I raced out of the room. Phoebe grabbed me. "Come on," she said. From her locker, she took the evidence, which she had brought from home, and we both ran the 6 blocks to the police station. I am not exactly sure why I went along with Phoebe. Maybe it was because of that poem about the traveler, or maybe it was because I had begun to believe in the lunatic, or maybe it was because Phoebe was taking some action, and I admired her for it. I wished I had taken some action when my mother left. I was not sure what I could have done, but I wished I had done something. Phoebe and I stood for 5 minutes outside the police station, trying to make our hearts slow down, and then we went inside and stood at the counter. On the other side of it, a thin man with thumpingly large ears was writing on a black book. "Excuse me," Phoebe said. "I'll be right with you," he said. "This is absolutely urgent. I need to speak to someone about a murder," Phoebe said. He looked up quickly. "A murder?" "Yes," Phoebe said, "or possibly a kidnapping, but the kidnapping might turn into a murder." "Is this a joke?" "No, it is not a joke," Phoebe said. "Just a minute." He went up to a plump woman dressed in dark blue uniform. He whispered to her, and she turned to look at us. She came to the counter and leaned over it. She wore big round glasses with thick lenses. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked. When Phoebe explained, the woman smiled. "Is this something you girls have read in a book, perhaps?" "No, it is not," I said. That was the turning point, I think, when I came to Phoebe's defense. I didn't like the way the woman was looking at us, as if we were two fools. I wanted that woman to understand why Phoebe was so upset. I wanted her to believe Phoebe. "May I ask who it is who has been kidnapped or possibly murdered?" the woman said. Phoebe said, "My mother." "Oh, your mother. Come along, then." Her voice was rather too sugary and sweet, as if she was speaking to tiny children who had asked to go to the toilet. We followed her to the little room with the glass partitions. An enormous man with a huge head and neck and massive shoulders sat behind a desk. His hair was bright red and his face was covered in freckles. He did not smile when we entered. After the woman repeated what we had told her, he stared at us for a long time. He said his name was Sergeant Bickle, and Phoebe told him her name. Then she told him everything. She explained about her mother's disappearing and about the note from Mrs. Cadaver, and then about Mrs. Cadaver's missing husband and the rhododendron bush, and finally about the lunatic and the mysterious message. At this point, Sergeant Pickle said, "What sort of messages?" Phoebe was prepared. She pulled them out of her book bag and laid them on the desk in the order in which they had arrived. He read each one out loud. Don't judge a man until you've walked 2 moons in his moccasins. Everyone has his own agenda. In the course of a lifetime, what does it matter? You can't keep the birds of sadness from flying over your head, but you can keep them from nesting in your hair. Sergeant Bickle looked up at the woman seated next to us, and the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. To Phoebe, he said, "How do you think these are related to your mother's disappearance?" "I don't know," she said. "That's what I want you to find out." Sergeant Bickle asked Phoebe to spell Cadaver's name. "It means corpse," Phoebe said, "dead body." "I know. Is there anything else you would like to show me?" Phoebe pulled out the envelope with the unidentifiable hair strands. "Phoebe, you could have these analyzed." "Oh, perhaps you could have these analyzed," she said. Sergeant Bickle looked at the woman, and again the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. The woman removed her glasses and wiped the lenses. They were not taking us seriously, and I felt my ornery donkey self waking up. I mentioned the potential blood spots that Phoebe had marked with adhesive tape. "But my father removed the tape," Phoebe said. Sergeant Bickle said, "Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Winterbottom and Miss Hiddle." I said, "Salamanca Hiddle." "Miss Winterbottom and Miss Hiddle, I wonder if you would excuse me a few minutes. Would you mind waiting here?" To the woman he said, "Why don't you stay with these young ladies?" So we sat there with the woman. She asked Phoebe, Mrs. said, about school and about her father and her mother and her sister. She had an awful lot of questions, and I kept wondering where Sergeant Bickle had gone and when he was coming back. He was gone for over an hour. There were 3 framed pictures on Sergeant Bickle's desk, and I tried to lean forward to see them, but I couldn't. I was afraid the woman would think I was nosy. Phoebe asked the woman if she might try on her glasses. The woman handed them to Phoebe. "Goodness," Phoebe said, "the world must look very different to you than it does to me." "Yes," she said, "I suppose it does." "I am certainly glad that I can see normally," Phoebe said. Sergeant Bickle finally returned. Behind him was Phoebe's father. Phoebe looked extensively relieved, but I knew it was not a coincidence that her father had come to the police while we were there as well. "Mrs. Winterbottom," Sergeant Bickle said, "your father is going to take you and Mrs. Hiddle home now." "But," Phoebe said, "Mr. Winterbottom, we'll be in touch, and remember, if you would like me to speak with Mrs. Cadaver—" "Oh, no," Mr. Winterbottom said. He looked embarrassed. "Really, that won't be necessary. I do apologize." We followed Mr. Winterbottom outside. In the car, he said nothing. I thought he might drop me off at my house, but he did not. When we got to their house, the only thing he said was, "Phoebe, I'm going to talk with Mrs. Cadaver. You and Sal wait here." When he returned from visiting Mrs. Cadaver, he said that she was unable to give him any more information about Phoebe's mother's call. All Mrs. Winterbottom had said was, "Tell George I am fine and that I will phone him soon. Tell him I would phone him now if I could, but I can't." "That's all?" Phoebe asked. "Your mother also asked Mrs. Cadaver how you and Prudence were. Mrs. Cadaver told her that, as far as she knew, you and Prudence were fine." "Well, I am not fine," Phoebe said. "And what does Mrs. Cadaver know anyways? And besides, Mrs. Cadaver is making the whole thing up. You should let the police talk to her. You should ask her about the rhododendron bush. You should find out who the lunatic is. Mrs. Cadaver probably hired him. You should—" "Phoebe, your imagination is running away with you." "It is not, Phoebe." "Mom loves me," she said, "and she would not leave me without any explanation." And then her father began to cry.